Welcome back to Fast Market here on the Schwab Network. It's time for our cash tag segment. For that, let's bring in Megan Brantley, Vice President of Research at Likefolio. Welcome back to the show, Megan.
Thanks for having me, guys. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday to you. So we're talking AMD, the competitor now to NVIDIA in the AI chip space. But, Megan, this stock sold off over $30 or 30% from its all-time highs that we saw in March. So we're seeing some weakening moves on the stock. Does your data support this weakness?
So this is one of those instances when we look at that we start to see some divergence. And what I mean by that is we see consumer sentiment, consumer interest heading in one direction, the stock heading in the other. So you mentioned we've got a bit of a pullback unfolding right now, but our data, we actually show considerable growth. Mention volume has increased by about 18% year over year. And that's mostly driven by its rise in product lineup. So something that we've got an eye on, and you can see that on this chart here on the very far right side of that chart, you can start to see a gap between that mentioned volume and where the stock is trading currently. So this is something that we personally love to see because we feel like this gives our data a bit of an edge, and especially where we expect the stock to be trading in the future. And another thing that I think is really interesting is whenever you look at a pie chart of all of the consumer mentions for the chip companies that we follow. So that's AMD, that's NVIDIA, and that's Intel. And what's happening here is that AMD piece of the pie is getting larger. So consumer interest in AMD and its products is growing, and it's chipping away, especially at that Intel piece of the pie. And it's even starting to chip away a little bit at the NVIDIA piece. Now, obviously, NVIDIA is still much larger, but this is something interesting to see, especially when you consider the stock performance, that now the bar might be a bit lower. It definitely makes a bullish play very enticing.
Megan, I was doing some more reading this morning about AMD, and they consider themselves to be a competitor of NVIDIA, but NVIDIA's killing them in terms of competition, right? And how about this stat? In conference calls this past quarter, after earnings events, for every one time AMD was mentioned, NVIDIA was mentioned 9 times. So this is, these new chips that NVIDIA brought out, they basically jumped way ahead of these chips that AMD thought were really going to compete. Now, AMD's probably going to still do a certain market share because they're less expensive and they'll compete. But is this really turning into a one-horse race? Can AMD really compete with NVIDIA? That seems like they're playing chess when AMD's playing checkers.
I think NVIDIA is obviously leading. This is the best of breed player in this realm. And this is something that I think we've even talked about on the show. I think I've talked about NVIDIA with you guys pretty recently, and definitely a name that we're bullish on. But we think that this segment, and especially the AMD's adoption of and embracement of its data center segment, which saw pretty significant growth last quarter, I think up 80% year over year. We saw what this did for NVIDIA. So we think that AMD is taking the right steps and it's heading in the right direction. But this chart, you can see here really where NVIDIA looks like it's pulling away. It's setting the standard, right? This is the visionary. This is the name that everyone is trying to catch. But of all of the other names in our universe, we think AMD is the next closest to catching NVIDIA, right? To taking a little bit of that market share. Like you said, maybe its products are a little bit more affordable. Maybe a lot of consumers are still really happy with AMD's products. Whenever we look at consumer happiness levels, I think this is interesting. We actually have AMD happiness levels about 3 points higher than NVIDIA. And so I think for us, this is pretty indicative of future growth. Obviously, AMD has a large gap to fill to catch up to NVIDIA, but of all of the other names that we're tracking, AMD looks the most promising.
Megan, and I noticed on your mentions count, year over year up 18%. We've seen that dispersion between those all-time highs from March to the levels that we're seeing now. It's off significantly on a dollar and percentage basis. Are you guys still reflective of data being positive on this one?
Yeah, I think that overall happiness levels are high and they're actually up by 2 points year over year. So from the consumer perspective, that's strong for us. We like to see that continued growth in mention volume. The only thing that we've got to keep an eye on are those web visits. You saw on that chart, they were flat to down about 2 points year over year. So obviously we want to see that growing, and that's something that we'll be tracking very closely. But for now, overall, especially considering where the stock is trading, we feel like this is a potential bullish divergence opportunity, partially just because of the massive tailwinds in AI and data that are lifting a lot of names. And we don't think it's just going to be NVIDIA that's a winner. We do see AMD as a winner also.
All right, great stuff, great data as always, Megan. Appreciate it. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, guys. You too.
All right, that's Megan Brantley, Vice President of Research at Likefolio, joining us, breaking down AMD. You know what, Kev?